Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. And in this next segments, we're going to hear about Syria, their status as refugees and the Turkish border, the Ukraine, and other topics discussed by the UN and by the UN Security Council. First, let's focus on Syria and the refugees escaping the Syrian fighting across into the Turkish border, as being discussed by Linda Thomas Greenfield, Dame Barbara Woodward, and Geraldine Byrne Nason and Trina Hemmerbach. They are from, of course, the U.S., representatives from the United States, Great Britain, Ireland, and Norway. They're all talking about the desperation of, especially the women that are refugees. As we know that some of the most victimized people in our world, and some of the most vulnerable people are women and children refugees, being trafficked, being raped, and having other things done to them. They are in need of supplies, medical supplies, food, and other things, as well as there is going to be a question asked about Turkey wanting to have military operations just on the other side or near the border of Syria, where the refugees are trying to cross into Turkey seeking safety. So let's listen to the representatives from the United Nations as well as the press briefing on what is World Refugee Day at the United Nations.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just saw my Irish and Norwegian colleagues here, so I assume they were here discussing the same issue I'm here to talk about. I'm about to head into the Security Council for a meeting on the humanitarian situation in Syria. This meeting is especially consequential because we are fast approaching the deadline to renew and expand the UN's cross-border mechanism, which allows humanitarian assistance to reach nearly 2.5 million people in northwest Syria who, as we all know, are in dire need. As many of you know, I recently traveled to the Turkey-Syria border, my second trip there in 2 years, to see the crossing with my own eyes, meet with aid workers, and hear directly from Syrian refugees who are now living in Turkey. During all of my travels, I try to meet with refugees, and today on World Refugee Day, I'm thinking of those I've had a chance to meet and of the stories they've shared with me over the course of my career. And I'm thinking of the more than 100 million people worldwide who've been forced to leave their homes because of war, persecution, violations of their human rights. Syrian refugees in Turkey shared with me over and over that they are worried that the world was forgetting about their plight, and that really broke my heart. Refugee women said we were no longer outraged by their situation. But I can tell you that the United States has not forgotten them. We remain the world's top donor of humanitarian aid in Syria, and just last month I attended the Brussels conference to announce over $800 million in new assistance to the Syrian people. But I've also made clear that no amount of aid will meet the needs on the ground if we can't actually reach people in need. And that's what makes the UN cross-border mechanism such a vital lifeline. And that's why I will be making the case to the Security Council in just a few minutes that we have to stand united to renew and expand this mandate. This is our chance to make clear to the Syrian people who have endured over a decade of brutal conflict that we've not forgotten about them and that we will continue to support them in their time of need. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. As you just heard from the US, from Linda, this afternoon the Council is going to be discussing the humanitarian situation in Syria ahead of the cross-border mandate, which is renewed next month. As you know, the number of people who need aid, desperately need aid, is higher than ever. Over 2.5 million people now depend on the aid coming through via the UN. And if more people need aid, it makes sense to get more aid into the country. And so the obvious answer is to open more border crossings. We recently had a letter in the Security Council from 32 NGOs asking us to keep the border crossing open. They're the ones who are seeing the suffering. They're the ones who are trying to deliver the humanitarian aid to help the vulnerable and deliver medical care. And I really think that we on the Council need to listen to them. So that is exactly what I'm off to do. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As you know, Ireland and Norway are co-pen holders on the Syria humanitarian file. And this afternoon, the Security Council meets again to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Syria. And we're looking forward to hearing from Secretary General Guterres, from Emergency Relief Coordinator Griffiths, and from the coordinator of the NGO Forum in northwest Syria. The humanitarian needs in Syria are at their highest level since the start of the conflict 11 years ago. The needs are overwhelming, and yet they continue to increase, and 14.6 million people are now dependent on humanitarian assistance. Food prices, as we know, are soaring, resulting in food insecurity for millions of people. And Syrians need as much aid as possible, as quickly as possible. With the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2585 last year, the Council renewed the delivery of cross-border humanitarian aid to northwest Syria, and the UN is sending 800 trucks per month over the border. There has been important progress in implementing other elements of the Resolution too, and we welcome the 5 cross-line convoys with vital humanitarian supplies. There has also been significant progress on early recovery projects. A renewal of the resolution will also facilitate further early recovery projects.
So last week, Irish and Norwegian foreign ministers Coveney and Tweedfield visited Turkey and the Turkish-Syrian border at Bab al-Hawa. Our ministers saw firsthand that the UN cross-border mechanism remains the critical lifeline for millions who are in need in northwest Syria. Ireland and Norway are leading the Council's work on the renewal of the Syria cross-border resolution, as you've just heard, and together Ireland and Norway are focused on inclusive and constructive conversations with all Council members and partners. Our major and guiding focus is on the needs of the Syrian people. Ireland and Norway strongly support the use of all modalities to deliver this aid to the millions of people who are in need That means both cross-border and cross-line. The cross-border mechanism is a lifeline for millions of people. It cannot be replaced. The Council must ensure that it continues. We have one goal: a resolution of the Security Council to renew cross-border operation so that aid can continue to reach those in dire need in northwest Syria, and we look forward to pursuing that goal with our Council partners in the coming weeks.
Yes, if Russia was to use its veto on this file, which we've seen happen before, several times before, if it was to do that and stop the last border crossing, just spell out for us what that would mean.
We just said the cross-border mechanism can't be replaced, and we are focused at all times on the security and, importantly, the food and medical security of supplies for over 4 million people. Right now, what we're focused on is inclusive, constructive conversations. So we do what we did last year, which was to deliver unanimous support for this cross-border mechanism, which, again, cannot be replaced. We support cross-line, we support effort on early recovery, more effort. Bottom line is this is irreplaceable as a lifeline.
Thank you so much, Majid Ghaliru, Dow Media Network. I want to ask about Turkey's threat to start a military operation that will target northeast Syria, specifically 2 cities with the highest number of refugees, hundreds of thousands of refugees, that will definitely, according to the NGOs on the ground, will cause a huge refugee influx. What is your position on this? And since your foreign minister recently visited Turkey, do you have any message for Turkey about this upcoming military operation? Thanks.
Thank you. Our minister certainly had good conversations with the Turkish side. They know how important this is for the millions of people needing humanitarian aid. And at this point, we're just talking to all, trying to get the new unanimous resolution passed in the Council. That's Plan A.
What about the operation? My question was about military operation, but what about the resolution of that?
Today is World Refugee Day, and this year's theme is whoever, wherever, whenever, everyone has the right to seek safety. In a message for the day, the Secretary General notes that today the global refugee population is at a record high and that the war in Ukraine has triggered the largest and fastest displacement in Europe since the Second World War. The Secretary General points out that together with women, children, and men fleeing conflict elsewhere in the world, the total number of forcibly displaced people has reached 100 million, a grim indictment of our times. He stressed that the right to seek asylum is a fundamental human right and that people escaping violence or persecution must be able to cross borders safely. And as you've seen this weekend, ahead of World Refugee Day, the Secretary General visited refugee families from Iraq and Afghanistan who are now living in New York area. His first stop was in Brooklyn and then went to Queens. The Secretary General recalled that when he led the UN Refugee Agency, there were twice as many resettlement opportunities as available for refugees. He urged more states to open their borders to asylum seekers. He called on all to stand together in solidarity and defend the integrity of the international protection regime. For his part, Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner for Refugees, emphasized that the world has a choice: either come together to reverse the trends of persecution, violence, and war, or accept that the legacy of the 21st century is one of continued forced displacement. We all know which is right and smart, which is the right and smart thing to do, Mr. Grandi said. And as a note, a sad note on World Refugee Day, the World Food Programme warned today that further food ration cuts are imminent as for refugees as humanitarian needs multiply around the world while the funding struggles to keep pace. Ration cuts of up to 50% are impacting 3/4 of all refugees supported by the World Food Programme in Eastern Africa. Refugees living in Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda are the most impacted. Hamstrung by funding constraints, WFP has prioritized assistance to ensure that vital food reaches the most vulnerable families first. WFP said that these painful decisions are very often leave refugees without support at a time when food assistance is a difference between life and death. In 2021, WFP assisted nearly 10 million refugees globally. And from Ukraine, our humanitarian colleagues are telling us that intense hostilities were reported over the weekend across government and non-government controlled areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. In Donetsk, hostilities and shelling were particularly intense since Friday, and while we cannot verify the numbers, our partners on the ground and authorities from both sides indicate that dozens of houses and schools were destroyed in many settlements on both sides of the contact line. As parties to the conflict intensify military operation across Donetsk, they are leaving behind dozens of dead or injured civilians, including in areas that had not previously experienced fighting. The situation is similar in Luhansk Oblast, where shelling, airstrikes, and fighting are reportedly continuing to make life extremely difficult for people in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and other places in both government and non-government controlled areas. Our humanitarian colleagues tell us that people caught up in the fighting are facing urgent needs with access to basic services, particularly healthcare and water, and that those basic services are limited, especially in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Airstrikes and hostilities have also been reported this past weekend in northern and southern regions as well. As I said last week, the parties to the conflict have an obligation to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on them to make sure that civilians in Ukraine who have already gone through immense suffering are not only spared but have the opportunity to receive assistance. We, along with our humanitarian partners, are ready to expand our presence even further, but we need the parties to do their part. This afternoon, the Secretary General and the Emergency Relief Coordinator will brief the Security Council at 3 p.m., and that will be on Resolution 2585, which, as you all know, authorizes cross-border operations in Syria, and that resolution is up for renewal. The Secretary General is expected to make an appeal to the members of the Council to maintain consensus on allowing cross-border operations by renewing that resolution for an additional 12 months. And for Mr. Griffiths, he will brief on humanitarian conditions in Syria, where 14.6 million men, women, and children continue to need humanitarian help. Also in the Security Council this morning, Nicholas Haysom, the head of our peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, will brief you at the Security Council stakeout. They're in consultations right now after an open meeting, so we will give you an announcement, but he will stop by and take your questions, which I hope you will ask. And this morning, as you may have heard, he said that in the coming months, South Sudan will need national leadership, resources, and a visible commitment to the country's leaders to fulfill their responsibilities under the peace agreement and to take the necessary steps for the country to exit the transitional period. We've shared his full remarks with you, and he will answer your questions at the stakeout. Also briefing was Hada El Tahir Mudawi, OCHA's Director of Operations and Advocacy, who briefed on South Sudan. She said that against a backdrop of profound economic challenges, the drivers of conflict and climate shocks have resulted in dire humanitarian situation. When it gets as bad as it is in South Sudan, she said, the specter of severe hunger and famine results. And turning to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the UN peacekeeping mission there strongly condemned new attacks by the M23 against its own positions in Shanxi in the North Kivu province. Our colleagues say that yesterday and today, the M23 has used at least 9 mortars to directly target the mission's base. The mission continues to support the Congolese army in its fight against the M23 and to protect civilians impacted by the clashes in line with its mandate and in compliance with the human rights due diligence policy. As the heads of state of the conclave are meeting today in Kenya, Bintu Keita, the head of the peacekeeping mission, reiterated our support to national and regional efforts for peace and stability in the eastern DRC, including through the Nairobi process. Also in the message For the first International Day of Countering Hate Speech, Ms. Keita condemned the proliferation of hate speech in the context of renewed attacks by the M23 and called on those parties partaking in such behavior to be brought to justice. She stressed that Congolese men and women, as well as people in all of the Great Lakes region, need to stand together against violence and hatred. She also echoed the Secretary General's own call to all the Congolese armed groups to participate unconditionally in the disarmament, demobilization, and community recovery stabilization programs, and on armed foreign groups to immediately disarm and return to their countries of origin. Also on the DRC, you will have seen that we issued a note to correspondents over the weekend. Staying in the same country, our colleague Bruno Le Marquis, the head of the humanitarian operations in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has also expressed his concern about the violence in the eastern part. Since the beginning of the year, 11 sites hosting internally displaced people in Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu have been attacked by armed groups. In the Ituri province alone, more than 200 displaced people have been killed in the last 9 months. At least 15 health facilities and 58 schools have been targeted in armed attacks this year, over half of them in North Kivu province. The humanitarian coordinator said that sites hosting displaced people are no longer safe havens, as they should be. Respect for international humanitarian law is now more important than ever. Humanitarians' needs are increasing, but insecurity and limited funds are hampering aid operations. At least 116 security incidents directly affect humanitarian staff or assets have been reported since January. The country's humanitarian response plan seeks $1.88 billion this year. It is only 20% funded. We were asked recently about reports of killings in Ethiopia over the last couple of days, and I can tell you that the Secretary General condemns the reported killing of scores of civilians in Oromia this weekend. He reiterates his call for all hostilities to stop and for all actors to ensure the protection of civilians. Mr. Guterres urges the Ethiopian government to take urgent steps towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Oromia. Turning to Mali, you will have seen that the Secretary General strongly condemned yesterday's improvised explosive device attack in the Kidal region against a convoy of UN peacekeepers who were conducting a search and detection operation for mines. One peacekeeper from Guinea was killed. The Secretary General conveys his heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims as well as the people and government of Guinea. The Secretary General recalls that the attacks targeting the UN peacekeepers may constitute war crimes under international law. He calls to the Malian authorities to spare no efforts in identifying the perpetrators of the attack so they can be brought to justice swiftly. The Secretary General reaffirms the solidarity of the UN with the people and authorities of Mali in their pursuit of peace and security. And Stephanie Williams, Special Advisor for Libya, you will have seen, made closing statements today at the end of the third and final round of negotiations between the joint House Representatives and High Council of State Committee on the Libyan constitutional track, which took place in Cairo. She said the Joint Committee achieved a great deal of consensus on the contentious articles of the Libyan draft constitution, but added the differences persist on measures governing the transitional period leading up to elections. The Special Advisor calls on the presidencies of the two chambers to meet within 10 days to agree at an agreed-upon location to bridge the remaining outstanding differences. She said the UN remains committed to supporting all Libyan efforts to end the country's long period of transition and instability through inclusive and transparent national elections at the earliest possible date, and to meet with the aspirations of nearly 3 million who have registered to vote. And this morning, in a tweet, the UN mission in Afghanistan condemned the attack that took place earlier today in a crowded bazaar in Nangarhar province, which killed and wounded scores of civilians, among them children. The UN mission stressed that continued attacks targeting civilians across Afghanistan must cease immediately. And our colleagues in the UN Development Coordination Office tell us that we have a new resident coordinator in Vietnam following the agreement by the host government. Pauline Temesis of the Philippines took up her post as resident coordinator. As you know, resident coordinators lead our work on the ground to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals while continuing to coordinate our support to national authorities in responding to and recovering from the multifaceted impacts of the pandemic. with a focus on providing services to most vulnerable, including refugees. Her full bio of our new colleague is on the interweb. I think I'm done. Edward.
Hi, Steph. First, on Ukraine, you just mentioned about the humanitarian situation in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Does the UN have another plan to coordinate with Russia and Ukraine and ICRC to have another evacuation plan there?
We are in constant touch with all parties to see how we can help. The Mariupol operation, the Azovstal operation, was a very specific operation, but obviously we remain available to help in any way we can.
And since you just mentioned about the food crisis also in East Africa, any update on the grain exportation from Ukraine?
No, nothing to share with you. The discussions are going on intensively. Secretary General is being briefed every morning, but we have nothing concrete to announce at this point.
And finally, a follow-up. I believe this is the second time I ask you in several weeks on this. Is this attack in Mali targeted to UN staff, or just like you said, it's an IED that might target everybody?
Again, I think I know you've asked me this question, and it's complicated to answer. It is clear that those groups who are working against the Malian people, who are working against peace, want chaos and want bloodshed, and they are targeting civilians, and they're targeting the UN peacekeepers. They're targeting the security forces as well. I say this with knowing that you can't get the answer, but it's a question to ask them. But it would be naive for our part to think that this just happened by happenstance, and they weren't. This was not part of a larger campaign that includes working against the UN.
But for the previous two incidents happened in Mali, is there any update on the situation? What's the investigation suggest?
Well, first of all, it is up to the Malian authorities themselves to investigate a crime that has happened on their territory. What has happened since then is that the UN is continuing its robust posture in Mali. And you see it tragically through the continued attacks, the continued loss of life of our colleagues, the continued wounding of our colleagues. These attacks have not stopped us from fulfilling our mandate.
And I just want to...
I'll come back to you.
I just want to confirm this. This is the 7th attack since May 22nd, right?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but we can confirm that to you. Senora.
So you mentioned the Secretary General visit to Afghan refugees and Iraqi refugees. The U.S., according to the latest report, is rejecting over 90% of Afghans who were not evacuated last year during the movement of the troops of the U.S., and that includes some of the family members of translators who helped the U.S. Fight the Taliban. Is any concern, especially today that we are celebrating World Refugee Day, and the fact that it's more difficult for Afghans to be able to acquire refugee status in the U.S.?
Well, our concern is not just about the U.S. Our concern is globally. The fact that there is a trend towards fewer and fewer places for men and women and children who are fleeing violence to find refuge. There are less places for asylum seekers, many less, and we see all over the world a trend of making it more difficult for people to even get to some place where they can seek asylum and ask for asylum.
Another question I have, what's the Secretary General reaction to the election yesterday in Colombia? We know that for the first time the country has elected the first left-leaning candidate. He's an ex-guerrilla member. Would that be possible without the peace process, which the UN was very involved to be able?
Well, I mean, I think we can only welcome what has been largely a peaceful election in Colombia, which I think is a reflection of the strength of Colombian democracy and of the progress made so far. Though I do expect a more formal statement on that shortly. Yep.
Stefan, you mentioned the one peacekeeper from Guinea who was killed in Mali, but over the weekend. That was in Kidal. But 20 civilians were killed in Gao over the weekend. If right, Malian soldiers, peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, and French soldiers from Barkhane, because they're not, they don't have, everybody has not left, are based in Gao. So yet they are unable to prevent attacks. Does MINUSMA still have a purpose in Mali?
Look, let's frame the question a different way, and let me answer part of it first. First of all, we cannot condemn enough these attacks on civilians. We do highlight when our own colleagues are killed, but it is clearly the civilians in Mali and throughout Sahel who are on the front lines. Is the mission able to prevent every attack on civilians? Of course not. I mean, we don't have the manpower to prevent every attack. But it is clear by its continued robust posture, by continuing to be out on the road, by continuing to be out in villages, they do provide a level of protection. But the safety and security of all the Malian people cannot rest solely on the shoulders of the peacekeeping mission. But I can tell you, and I think for most of us it's pretty clear, that the situation would be much worse if the peacekeepers were not there. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Stefan. Have you received any response from the Libyan parties regarding the call to hold another meeting after 10 days?
No, not that I'm aware of. No. Okay. Monsieur.
Merci, Steph. 5 UN organs like Martin Griffith, UNICEF have called last week to extend a cross-border aid mechanism to Syria. Is there any action, any steps from your side to let the Security Council take those calls into considerations? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the Secretary General will put that call out again very clearly this afternoon in person when he speaks to the Council. The decision-making is in the hands of the 15 Security Council members. We very much hope that they will renew the resolution for another 12 months. It is critical for the well-being, for the life, frankly, of so many people who depend on the cross-border delivery of aid to survive. It is also critical that we continue on the cross-line delivery of aid. It is not an either-or. Both are needed. Okay. Paul, do you have another question? Yes.
So the government of Norway announced that the 2 leaders of the negotiations of Venezuela will be in Oslo at the Oslo Forum to talk about the process. This is part of the negotiators' meeting that they have just as part of the forum. How important it is for the Secretary General to see that the 2 leaders are meeting in Oslo with the Norwegian government? Is this probably a sign that the talks may restart, and is the UN possibly involved in that?
Well, you asked me if it's a good or bad sign. It's clearly a good sign, right? It's a good sign when people with clearly very different viewpoints agree to sit down, and we can't thank the Norwegian authorities enough for their support. The Mexican government has also been very helpful. I think we're past the prediction point. So I think we need to, like this case and so many, we need to take things one day at a time, but it is clearly, it is a positive development. Ms. Kubiak, and then Mr. Haysom will be ready. We'll launch Mr. Haysom as soon as Paulina is done.
All right. Good afternoon and happy Friday, everyone.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.